Hello and welcome to another edition of Sci-Fi 2021, a second year where we are doing this in a virtual format. Much has changed and much remains the same. So it's great to see all of you here, and it's great to have our audience in as well to debate what next for the cyber universe. We've got a fairly broad topic that we're discussing today, but perhaps that's great because it gives people a lot more elbow room to interpret it and really lay out the challenges. We're talking about online spaces, not specifically just social media, and how it can and should be made a safer space. This debate has gotten quite heightened in across the world, really, and in India as well in the last year and a half. And much has happened both by way of news developments as also people becoming more aware of the risks attached with abuse or threat online. I've got a packed panel to discuss all of that and its various facets. So let me, without further ado, introduce all of them to you. Lydia Khalil, who's Research Fellow in the West Asia Program, Lowy Institute. Lydia, welcome. Radhika Radhakrishnan, who's Gender Research Manager at the World Wide Web Foundation. Radhika, great to have you on the show as well. Apar Gupta, Executive Director of the Internet Freedom Foundation. Apar, welcome. And Pooja Haldea, who's Senior Advisor for the Center for Social and Behavioral Change at the Ashoka University. Pooja, welcome, and thank you all for joining in. I thought we might keep this a broad based opening comment from you all, and then we can really get more granular with it. So I'll pass the baton around if I may. Lydia, let me start with you in terms of what you think are the key changes that you've seen in the online space, particularly given the reference of the last year and a half and what the world really has lived through with COVID.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for including me in this discussion. It's really an honor to be with you. It's one of the first times actually I've been involved in the Sci-Fi Network and with colleagues in India. So this is a real privilege and a treat for me. So thank you very much for having me. You're right, it is an incredibly broad question. Perhaps I might be able to offer my perspective on that based on what my current research focus is in terms of how online spaces are changing. In terms of taking a look at the online environment, my area of focus takes a look at violent extremism and disinformation. So certainly over the past year and a half, we've seen moves by major social media companies in terms of content moderation and deplatforming, particularly since the Christchurch attack that took place in New Zealand. So from my spot in the world, in Australia and the Asia Pacific, that Christchurch attack was extremely consequential, and we saw a number of social media platforms taking much more aggressive moves in terms of deplatforming and content moderation. That being said, so many of these social media platforms, particularly the mainstream ones like Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, are so large that no matter what their content moderation and deplatforming efforts are, they always seem to be lagging behind. We've seen that also too with the QAnon phenomenon in terms of putting forward politically motivated conspiracy theories, COVID disinformation and things like that. That was allowed to fester on online platforms for quite a while before the major social media platforms were alert to it so they could take it down. They since do and did, but then the damage has already been done. So on one hand, over the past year and a half, we've been seeing increasing awareness and increasing efforts by the tech industry to deal with content moderation and deplatforming when it comes to disinformation and violent extremist activity. On the other hand, they are such large platforms, it's such a dynamic space that we still haven't been able to completely get our arms around it. The other major trend, I would say, along with that deplatforming, is that we were seeing a move by extremist actors who have been deplatformed to smaller, unregulated spaces. So those are some just initial observations. Perhaps I could just offer those to get it kickstarted, and then as the discussion goes along, I'm sure many more things have popped up. But I would say that those are the two main things that I've been seeing from kind of my perch or vantage point studying online extremism.
No, that's great. Thank you for adding that. Radhika, the other vantage point that you're sitting at is gender. Not new in terms of being, the victim of online abuse or hate or, extreme conversation with violent threats. Would you say any significant ground has been covered in the last year and a half?
Right. Thank you so much for having me here once again. And I'll just keep my opening comments brief, and hopefully we can discuss that a little bit more throughout the discussion today. So you're right that not a lot of this is necessarily new when we look at it from a more gendered perspective, especially because what we've been calling now for a long time as a new normal has actually been the normal in the lives of a lot of marginalized communities, even when it comes to online violence, for example. It has always existed, but in a lot of cases, maybe it's existed under the wraps, or it's not something that's got as much focus because it wasn't really in the mainstream earlier. So I think what COVID has really done in the past few years is sort of make us sit up and really reckon with these issues that I think were sort of largely present even earlier. In some ways, it has, of course, increased our dependency on a lot of these spaces and a lot of these online platforms, which is also why the degree of it is perceived to be higher in some cases, in the sense of violence, etc. But the phenomenon of this happening itself, the way power relations work to make this place so unsafe for women and other marginalized communities, I think the crux of that has largely sort of remained the same. But things have differed in terms of, let's say, maybe responses. The state's response has been to, for example, increase surveillance upon women to go hand in hand with what they think is safety. And there are, of course, lots of problems with that I'm happy to get into during the conversation we have. But yes, I think I'd like to go with the opening that a lot of this is conversations that a lot of feminists have been trying to push for a very long time. And at least it's finally something that most people are now discussing because COVID has sort of made us sit up and take notice of it and try to have that conversation in different ways and in certainly a very difficult context.
Pooja, let me turn to you and sort of ask you to collate your thoughts of what you've made of the last year and a half, and whether you think it's been seminal in any way, with regards to online safety.
Thanks for the question. So, again, the work that I do actually focuses a lot on human decision making or from a user's perspective. And so maybe I'll share a few thoughts on that. I think if anything that the last 1.5 years has shown us is that individuals can be actually they're not as well equipped as we'd like them to be to make decisions which are often in best interest of themselves or others. I think the information that has been out there around COVID and all the misinformation that is spread has only led to, if I could say, more skepticism from a user's perspective on what to believe, what to not to believe, and often this skepticism can lead to decision paralysis, and so therefore even the decisions that they're making online in terms of privacy, in terms of data protection, etc., has all been impacted, I would say, negatively. I would also want to say that the one trend in that some of the work that also we've been looking at it is that how much of this responsibility for online safety should lie on the users versus regulation or platform. And I think where we're sort of seeing is that users, by the way, even if you see the parallel in offline safety, when you talk about mask wearing, right? I mean, we did try to do a lot of work on, behavior change and getting people to internally feel motivated to wear masks. But, behavior change in a short period of time, very drastic change, is very hard to do at an individual level. And therefore, you found regulators, stepping in with mandates and so on and so forth. And I feel like there is a similar analogy in the online world as well, where increasingly our research is showing that leaving the responsibility at an individual to make the right decisions is often, it's fighting a losing battle, because the algorithms and the system that the choice architecture that individuals are in can be pretty confusing, pretty hard to navigate. And I think therefore one of the things that we've been looking at it is the role of the regulators, the role of the platforms much more, rather than depending on you and me to be able to sort of make online safety a reality.
Okay, I'm going to be interested in hearing what Apar has to say about this. Apar, I put the difficult task of putting all of it into context on your shoulders. I want you to respond also to what you just heard and give me your sense of the last year and a half with an online safety lens.
So I agree with, firstly, the initial statements which have been made by Lydia, Radhika, and Pooja, and to a large degree, it's reflected in data. I would like to bring some data to their interventions as well. From two lenses. The first is with respect to safety, as in causing a crime, and where I'd like to refer to certain points of National Crime Records Crime in India report, which of course will be collating data from a timeline, I think, right before the pandemic, but still will be instructive in terms of that trend, which becomes deeper at a later point in time. And secondly, on accessibility, because I think political participation, technical participation, and economic participation is what is really necessary. And we can get into it at a later point. To discuss how will those interventions be crafted towards increasing safety for women as well as certain communities who bear the disproportionate amount or the predominant amount of online abuse. The first is with respect to the National Crime Records Bureau data. It marks an upward trend. And quite often, commentators have indicated this is due to the number of increase of registration of FIRs under certain provisions of the IT Act, which relate with financial crimes such as identity theft. That's also a form of, under Section 66, that's also a form of cybercrime, but quite often is also directed towards people who are sometimes not as technically adept. Quite often people who are coming from lower income groups or from higher age groups as well. That has been an inference generally if you look through that data. And I think that's only deepened over a period of time. The second is that this rise in cybercrimes has also been tied to an increase in access. And the access over the pandemic, just in terms of sheer numbers of people who are firstly taking internet connections, broadband connections, has risen sharply. This also explains the reliance by people on the internet like never before, for instance, in terms of remote education, remote work, etc. However, access remains deeply unequal in terms of participation from women at the very least, which is data for the first time which has been made available through the report of the government itself. For instance, there's a it's by the National Family Health Survey, which has been complied by India's Men. 3.7 lakh households are captured across 17 states, 5 union territories, and it indicates that there is a vast disparity, even when there are the economic facilities which are similarly situated in a household for a man and a woman. And those disparities, in fact, for instance, that even in states with low overall internet penetration, such as Bihar, the percentage of women who have accessed the internet, ever accessed, so don't have the device, but have ever accessed the internet, is less than half of the men. So
Yeah.
essentially, with these two initial statements, I'd like to just look forward to the further conversation as it develops.
Yeah, and that as well is a fraction of what's happening in other states. So it's really a jagged line, as you said, Apar. Radhika, on this point of data and statistics, I mean, the last time I looked at the number of complaints about online harassment, which is something that the Women and Child Ministry has set up, it's really a disappointingly low figure of what, 200, 250. Has anything changed in terms of recourse to actual action, or do women still hesitate to take action against online harassment?
Right, thanks a lot. And I think Apar has sort of contextualized that really well to make that easier for me to respond to. So I think one issue is, of course, as Apar mentioned, access to these spaces in the first place. So, and I would differentiate between access and meaningful access, because access could just mean I may have gone online once in the past 6 months, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm actually connected. Meaningful access would be I have the money, the financial independence to actually be able to recharge my internet pack every month. I have the financial ability to afford that. I have a safe home, not just a safe online space, but a safe home where I can actually access my mobile phone without male members in the family thinking that's culturally inappropriate for me to do so, which is what is the situation in most parts of India. in most parts of India, we also have shared devices through which families access the internet together. So you can't. What if I'm a queer person in a household where I actually want access to content that's relevant to me and my situation and my sexuality, but that's not something I can do in a conservative household on a shared device. So there are a lot of these factors that sort of compound the experience of being online and the ability to even just be online, which has become worse during COVID, right? Because the idea that I can actually sit here in this room and speak about this speaks to my privilege of being able to have a room and privacy to be able to say these things out loud, which is not the case in most households. So, so relating that to your point about, reporting of crimes, I think that also requires a certain offline space where you can actually sort of safely even connect, where you can have these conversations, where you can report something and not fear the backlash of it in your actual offline life. So that online offline continuum sort of becomes increasingly important, and we're seeing that that is something that was really affected during COVID, because the entire house, especially during lockdowns, for example, was in one space. And then how are you going to really be able to have that kind of unhindered access to report something? Let's say to report something that's happened in your own house, for example, right? That makes it even more unsafe. So there are, of course, many layers to this that make that gendered experience a lot more difficult. And that's why statistics can't necessarily capture the nuances of this, because we know that, especially when it comes to cybercrime, most women actually prefer to not go to the law. And there are many reasons for this. One is, of course, the patriarchal attitudes within law enforcement itself, right? We know how difficult it is for women to actually register any kinds of complaints for any kinds of crimes, especially for something like cyber crimes, which are a newer, I mean, there isn't that much digital literacy around them yet for people to even take it seriously and want to complain. Second is just the amount of abuse that can be meted out online. And for every instance, can you possibly report it through the legal enforcement? And something that Apar will probably be able to talk about more is just how a lot of the laws in India under the IT Act itself are framed in a very patriarchal manner. They can be actually used and interpreted to be more punitive towards the person who's complained rather than actually be a support mechanism. So for a lot of these reasons, I actually don't rely very much on statistics often, and try to sort of understand what is the story behind why these numbers are coming out to be this way. And I sort of try to explain some of those reasons to the best of my understanding, but really looking forward to what the others on the panel have to share as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for making that point. Lydia, I want to take a parallel jump from access to information to also talking about access to legitimate information, just with reference to the areas that you discussed. A couple of months back, I was speaking with some people who had done a lot of research on deep state, and they made the point that with the coming in, for example, of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, there was simultaneously an online campaign launched to build the narrative of a Taliban 2.0. It really moves that fast, and it moves that fast for all sorts and forms of governments. Do you think that as well is a big threat, especially when we talk about violent extremism? The fact that I may have access to information, but I don't really have access to whether I'm getting the right information or true information.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and of course it's subjective, right? So the online environment has enabled both state and non-state actors to put forward various narratives out there. And so those narratives can be put forward by true information, disinformation, information that's contextualized in a particular manner. And now with the online environment, it gives just so much access and accessibility for people to put out their own narratives on there. You referenced what happened in Afghanistan. This narrative around the Taliban 2.0 intersected a lot with what was happening in the quote unquote real world. So you had influencers within the Afghan context who were supportive of the Taliban, very active not only in the languages of Afghanistan, but in English language media as well, because they understood they had various target audiences, and they were involved in a variety of mainstream platforms. But it was also accompanied by what was happening offline, which was the legitimization gradually over the past a few years past of the Taliban, having them be involved in negotiations, as a start. And so there's a very interesting intersection about what happens in the real world and what happens in the online spaces with that. And we can't discount either one of those. But taking it outside of the Afghanistan context, we see it here in Australia as well, as I'm sure you do in India. Various political factions use the online environment to put forward various narratives and various information and disinformation kind of contextualized in various ways. We've seen that certainly around COVID. People who, as I'm sure you're aware, Australia has very harsh COVID settings and restrictions ongoing within the country. And so there's been a lot of information and disinformation in the online environment by people who are anti-lockdown, anti-government. We've been seeing it move more and more into not only disinformation, but conspiracy theories, anti-government action that's fueling offline protests that have turned violent in Australia as well. And so there's this, in so many fronts, it's this intersection between the online and the offline. And certainly the online environment has been enabling by giving people more access, confusing the information environment. Sometimes something doesn't necessarily, a person doesn't have to be a conspiracist in order to believe some of that information that's out there. Just by the fact that they're muddying the waters makes it so much more difficult for people to disaggregate the various informations that's out there and to make sense of it all. So sometimes the risk is not people going down a rabbit hole, so to speak, into conspiracies or disinformation. The major risk, as I see it, is that people just throw up their hands and say, oh, I don't even know what's true or what's not even true. And then it just completely erodes trust, not only in government, but in our fellow neighbors, and a breakdown of social cohesion. So that's where I see the risks at the moment.
Pooja, come in on that. I mean, where does that leave the very complex relationship between individual user and regulation and platforms? Because you were making the point earlier that it's difficult to expect too much from an individual user. But what do you do in a context where even the platform might be, set up against you? It's gamed to fool you, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, no, I especially agree with what Lydia was saying, that if there is too much misinformation coming, so what do you as a user do? And this raising of hands is saying that I really am not in a good position to decide. And so in fact often it may lead you to go along with whatever has been chosen for you by the platforms, whatever the platform is showing you, whatever settings the platform puts for you, and so on and so forth. In fact, the individual may just become more fatalistic in the decision making, saying, this is so much information that I don't even know what to do in this. So, let's hope for the best and move on, right? And that can often actually work to their detriment. And that actually comes to the question that you're asking, that, platforms can and often do use tactics which are, seemingly in the interest of the user, but are often benefiting, themselves. A classic example is this whole concept of, illusion of control, where platforms may tell you that you now have more control over the settings, over what you can share. I know a big platform recently ran, in fact, an entire campaign on saying that we're passing the ownership to you. But research shows us that, when you do that, what happens is users become more lax, often about what they're sharing, not sharing, and in fact end up sharing sometimes even more data with the platform than they would have done otherwise. So you believe that because you have the control, so it's an illusion of control, but are you going to do anything with that control? Most often than not, you don't do anything with that control, and in fact become more complacent. So there are things, so platforms, when they are actually saying that we're pushing back the control over to users, are in fact making it harder for users to take decisions which are in their best interest. And similar, there are many such things like that. The default settings which get set up by by platforms, even though we can change it, we often don't, because either we believe the defaults are best for us, or we think that we don't have the energy or the mental bandwidth to do it. So there is a very complex relationship between platforms and users, and often it's not necessary that what's in the best interest of one will really lead to also the best interest of the other. And that's why I think that there is a role of regulation which is beyond the user and the platform. It's hard. I don't think regulation as an answer is an easy one, because technology moves at such a rapid pace that it's often hard for regulators to keep in line. But I think the work that we do shows that platforms and users are only just one part of the answer, probably the smaller one. The kind of choice architecture, the kind of defaults, the kind of nudges that structurally a regulator can put can have a far more wide-reaching impact.
Apar, do you want to respond to that with an additional question on? So one part is regulation, and the other, that was an interesting term, is digital civic duties. Reporting malinformation on WhatsApp, reporting violent speech, which has the very real risk of tipping over into vigilantism. That's the problem, because you're not expecting a nuanced and very healthy and democratic debate online. At least I haven't come across it. How do you find the best midway between regulation on the one hand and this idea of digital civic duties on the other?
I think that's been articulated very well by the Web Foundation, who have last year also, or this year, early this year, released a new contract for the online space. They've essentially said that the health of our online conversations is in danger. Just like to go back to the smaller points about what are the platforms doing, for instance. So the thing is that there's a lot of critique which is leveled against the platforms, but a lot of times it's not beneficial because it's not leading to an eventual outcome. The way to understand platforms is look at them as entities, and the nature of the entity being a private limited company serving shareholder profit. And then from that economic lens, understanding what engineering decisions are being taken and why they are being taken. At the shareholder level itself, all the large Silicon Valley companies have had independent shareholder proposals for appointments of directors who have expertise in human rights, and the board recommendation around them has been negative, that we do not want a person with a human rights expertise on our board. And this seems strange. So I think a larger amount of critique in terms of corporate governance may help us achieve the kind of outcomes we want beyond pure regulatory mechanisms by itself. The second part is the regulatory mechanism. When we look at a much more Indian context, what has been essentially a regulatory mechanism has been absent. We do not have a data protection authority. We have not also come up with a guidance on online harms like the UK has done. I have critiques against it, but at least they have articulated it. And finally, I'd like to indicate that some of the proposals which are being made on the back of safety towards women as well as targeted communities will actually undermine their online safety, which exists in a limited perspective. For instance, end-to-end encryption or mandating real world identity verification, taking away anonymity, would have direct impacts. In fact, our own work at IFF, where we have supported anonymity for Me Too complaints, for instance, which led to a suit for defamation by Apar Gupta in the High Court, where we were essentially supporting the stand of the survivor who was putting out these stories, will be impacted. So there are real world impacts which are not being considered in a much more holistic sense. And this is what I'd like to end with. There are multiple ways to approach this issue and this problem because it's a large problem. But the way it needs to be done is by first principles looking at appropriate amounts of allocations of responsibilities, and for people not to be made as the sole responsible element in this, because there are larger capacities both within state as well as technology companies.
Radhika, I want to take this conversation to a slightly different space, away from safety and security to the idea of economic opportunity that was also, briefly mentioned, but we didn't get into it in detail with specific reference to gender. My own interactions with women-only platforms platforms in the last year do throw up the fact that particularly in B and C cities, more and more women want to move online because there aren't enough jobs available. And that has led them to, by accident, becoming entrepreneurs. It is certainly easier to be a digital entrepreneur than to think of setting up, a brick and mortar business at this point. Uh, when does this conversation about online opportunity become less elitist? Even at this point, it's really seen as an elite problem, not something that affects a large part of India. But do you think it does? Has that change happened, and how can we do this with an eye specifically on economic opportunity for women?
Right, that's a great question. And maybe I'll give an example of the sex worker communities to sort of illustrate the less sort of or the more intersections of complexities here in terms of privilege. So during the pandemic, I think sex worker communities were one of the worst affected, and also what received one of the least amounts of attention, unfortunately. So some of the work I did in the past few years focused quite heavily on sex worker communities. So I'll draw upon that research to respond to this. So one immediate effect of the pandemic and the lockdown on sex worker communities was their financial independence. Because, if all your work is suddenly online, what are sex workers going to do when traditionally that work has required, physical contact? And so, what a lot of sex worker communities sort of found themselves in was that they were locked up in their homes where their families didn't know that they performed sex work for commercial purposes. And they had, so generally, sex workers have two SIM cards. They generally either have two mobile phones or two SIM cards. One they use for personal use and one they use for professional use. And this split is done in a way because of the stigma that sex workers face in society. They don't want those identities sort of being linked to each other publicly. What the situation they found themselves in was that they had to, first of all, move all their work online, which means they had to first learn how to use, let's say, something like Google Pay to, send a video to a client online and receive money for it. And then a lot of sex workers started now thinking, but hey, if I'm going to send a video to you online and you're going to pay me for it, even if I learn how to use Google Pay to do all of this or any of these other, banking apps to do any of this, what if you take a screenshot of what I'm sending you, and then you view it multiple times? That's essentially me performing the service multiple times. But we haven't come to a point yet where I feel like that nuance is really being understood, because we still don't really have a solution to this at the grassroots level, where a lot of these jobs have actually now moved online due to the nature of the pandemic, but there aren't sufficient solutions for them to actually continue to financially benefit from it. And so, for example, a lot of sex workers who are now within the homes, they could no longer actually even use that professional SIM card in their phones, because their parents, for example, or the families didn't know that this is where the money comes from. So they actually lost a lot of financial opportunities because of the pandemic, and unfortunately, not a lot of, or hardly any, government support was provided to these communities because of the criminalized nature of the activity, etc. So it's quite a saddening situation. But I feel like while we do have the gig economy and we do see a lot of a lot of people sort of benefiting from it in various ways, I think there are crucial demographics here that are really being missed out, and that we're really not understanding the actual plight of, to be able to do something about. And that's why I wanted to sort of share this side of the story, because we've all heard the success stories around the gig economy, and I really wanted to sort of maybe give this example to show how there are also financial losses being incurred by communities at the intersections of gender and sexuality because of the pandemic, that I don't think we've really sort of reckoned with and provided for in terms of any kinds of recourse or support. But I do hope that that's something that sort of changes going forward, even in terms of just communities themselves learning how to use these technologies to continue their livelihoods. Otherwise, it's people are in a really dire situation, and I don't think we're talking about that form of safety enough.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think The other black hole is education, frankly, which is not getting any attention, and the children cannot speak for themselves. But the deep cavity that we have in terms of learning for kids who either don't have access to a device or there's one device amongst five kids is really deeply disturbing. Apart, when I was reading the note as well about what we were going to discuss, users, moderators, platforms, I was bemused to see the absence of state in that question. Where does it fit in? So much water has flown under the bridge with regards to state either doing what it should not do or doing more than what it should do. Any key lessons drawn from this entire year and a half, and how individuals should approach interaction with state with regards to online freedom or online rights or access?
So, our work essentially is built on hope and optimism because we also think that technology is something which is giving us a tremendous amount of facility and benefit in this world, and that needs to be expanded. So, I think one thing which does align with our values at IFF with what is the stated government policies towards increase of access and connectivity, but that is only a foundation. Access by itself will not be meaningful, as Radhika indicated, if it will not be towards the autonomy or the liberty of an individual to utilize it for human function, for economic opportunity, for social participation, for political opinion. And I think that is where we sometimes draw attention in terms of state regulation, because that level of autonomy quite often invites criticism towards policy and execution. I think this is something which needs to be supported, but can only be done. And this is where I may have a certain disagreement with people, is that we need to much more popularly express what's at stake in this conversation to people. I don't think so. This is a conversation which needs to be only restricted to experts or activists or scholars on these panels. It needs to be a much more popular conversation, and it is already happening. So, since we do believe in hope, let me also offer some. Because when the WhatsApp privacy policy changed, I did notice for the first time a lot of people who are noticing, who are using WhatsApp, not concerned, but at least curious. Why is this change occurring and how will it impact them?
Mm. Lydia, come in on that, because this is not an India-only conversation. This pushback between state and platform and individual. There are other countries, for example, like Canada, that have floated working papers on what kind of state-level measures can happen against abuse. How should one approach that, you think?
Well, I think a general point to make is that states around the world have really dropped the ball in terms of regulation. I think in the beginning there was a lot of this kind of gee whiz attitude around internet technology, or some naivete, I think, around it. It's something that will bring us together, expand democracy, expand our minds. But we've seen actually unregulated that it can cause a considerable number of offline harms. I think, too, a lot of people within the regulatory environment, particularly elected officials, were very slow to understand how these platforms work. I remember a year ago looking at the United States congressional hearings on the tech industry, and the type of questions that the politicians and policymakers were asking were so basic that you actually got a sense that they didn't quite understand how these platforms work in order to regulate them enough. Now, I think that's shifted a bit, and I think there's more expertise that has come on board. I think that governments in the regulatory effort are looking at experts and civil society actors, and there's certainly a consensus now around the world that more regulation is absolutely needed. The question is when we're looking at global regulation, obviously the system of government within a particular state has a lot to do with it. So if you're living in a democracy, for example, that prides freedom of expression, freedom of speech, regulation is going to, of online content is going to interact with that. If you're in a state, like China, for instance, that's a whole other level of, what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And so when we're talking about global standards, that's something that I think is, if I can be frank, probably not possible at the moment. So it's going to be up to kind of like-minded democracies in order to come up with standards to regulate them, so it's not so ad hoc, and so that global technology platforms are going to have to address this according to the consolidation of all of those different type of governments. So I was recently in front of an Australian parliamentary inquiry on the use of technology and its relation to extremist actors, but there was a great deal of interest in terms of regulation around algorithmic transparency, around the type of information that's collected on users. All of those things have an impact in terms of the area that I study, which is violent extremism, but of course all of the things that my fellow panelists are also dealing with itself. So issues around what type of information these platforms have on the individual user. And frankly, they're black boxes. We do not know how their recommendation systems and algorithms work. I think sometimes those platforms also don't know. It's gotten to a point where it's beyond even their own, if you pay attention to recent reporting. So those are things that I think that we need to grapple with in the regulatory environment.
Pooja, let me narrow that question down, in terms of the points that Lydia is making, with specific reference to what happens when there is large amounts of regulation to marginalized communities, because that is the fear, that you put down these harsh penalties with short takedown windows, but it runs the risk that there is mass removal of lawful content, that, the majority takes over and stamps down the voice of the minority or a marginalized community. What is it that those who represent or are advocates for marginalized communities should be fighting for in this online universe?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I'll try and give at least one dimension to it, and then of course, the others can join in. I think one of the big problems when we look at the online environment for marginalized communities, and especially where either literacy levels or both, literacy to read, but also digital literacy levels are low, is that, this online universe becomes even more foreign, becomes that much more harder to navigate. When we even looked at things like, even for you and me, for example, consent is something we barely know before we sign it. But imagine if, of course, we don't even understand the language, or if you don't even understand, how to operate on, specific platforms. So I think one of the ways, and this is not the only, but I think one of the ways in which we can give more power to marginalized communities is making the online world a little less complicated, little, maybe even in some ways less text heavy, making it more oral, making it more visual, making it in fact in language and in even in terms of the way that it's presented, similar to what people would expect in an offline environment. So getting it closer to that is at least in one way making that environment less foreign, and thereby one of the big things that we've been looking at is confidence, because education is one thing, and literacy levels will increase as they will increase, but the more a person feels confident in an environment, more in control, and therefore can take actions or at least demand things which are more in line with what is good for them. So I think one of the ways in which you can make this environment more inclusive is to make it a little less foreign, which is what today it is to vast majority of populations in India. And I think time again we've seen that leaving it, and I've made this point, only to individuals isn't enough. Issues like obesity, climate change all show that in the short term especially we can be terrible at doing right what's right for us individually and for people around us. And there are good reasons for it, because our brains are biased to look for immediate gratification and not worry about long-term harm. So when we're in a hot state, say we are hungry or we're dying to access an app, or we get aggravated by an article that we've read online, our decision making is very focused. It's very directed towards achieving our immediate goal. And so therefore, recognizing these impulses, these biases is very critical in any policy that is put in place when it comes to online safety. We are working against very powerful algorithms. They want to maximize engagement, and rage engages, emotions engage. And, and so what we do at a regulatory level, we do at a platform level matters a lot. The kind of choice environment that we create online can lead to very different decision making at an individual level. I talked about, default settings, for example, which are mandated by regulators. They can lead to better results when it comes to data privacy. We've seen that even showing a small message against an article saying that, verify if it's true or not, can impact how much it's shared. We looked at star ratings. If you put star ratings like Amazon does on, is this website good in terms of the data it's collecting or not? Again, that can modify user behavior. And so we need to look at it from the lens of a user. We need to take into account that we are irrational, we are subject to biases, we are often incapable to take decisions which are in our best interest short term. And as I said, regulations especially need to take that lens into account when coming up with any action or policy.
No, absolutely. All fantastic points. I really appreciate all the insight that we gathered in today's chat. Thank you all for taking the time out, and more importantly, for being so honest and sharing so much of your own perspective. Thank you very much for joining in today.
Thank you so much.